Rafael, hi, and thank you so much for joining the discussion around biotech, how AI is impacting improvements in drug discovery and in discovering how patients actually respond to medications, which is what you are doing at Genialis. So maybe if we start with a very simple explanation what Genialis does. Let's take cancer as an example. In cancer, 10 out of 100 patients have an actionable mutation, which means that there's an identified drug for their specific mutation of cancer. But out of these 10 patients, only 3 to 4 will actually respond to a targeted therapy. So how does Genialis come into play in predicting the patient response to a specific drug?
Hi, Tiasha. Thank you. That's a great question and a great place to start because that's exactly what Genialis does. Genialis is a computational precision medicine company. We fancy ourselves the RNA biomarker company, in fact. And so we develop biomarker models, computational models, to help predict which patients will respond best to a particular therapy. And we do this because we envision a world where healthcare delivers the best possible outcomes for patients, their families, and communities. And as you point out, only 1 in 10 patients qualify for what we think of as a targeted therapy based on an actual mutation. And again, only 3 to 4, so 30 to 40% of those will respond. We try to figure out who are the other 6 or 7 patients and what are they going to respond to. But more than that, we build models that go beyond simple targeted therapy. So we would like to find good treatments for all 100 of those cancer patients, not just the 10 with an actionable mutation. This is why we build models that don't simply rely on DNA mutations, right? We build models that consider a vast array of evidence and ultimately use a high throughput data modality like RNA sequencing in order to predict the biologies of the disease, right? So rather than predicting will patient A respond to drug X, we want to understand the disease itself. We want to understand what is the nature of the malady, what's causing it, what's driving it. And based on a much more informative computational model, we can then come up with any number of potential interventions that are most likely to be successful for that patient.
Mm-hmm. It's a huge endeavor and something that I think we are constantly surprised around how basically with new scientific advancements, we keep on figuring out how much we still don't know and how complex the whole human body is. So it's really difficult to basically predict why something happens. And when you say that you are basically building all these models, what kind of data points do you use then to be able to try to create algorithms for prediction?
Yeah, so a standard approach might be to try to find a data set where some number of patients have been treated with a drug and then build a model that predicts or figures out what the patients who responded to that drug have in common, right? So imagine you've got 100 cancer patients and they've all been treated with a new drug and 30 of them did well. You can ask your machine learning algorithm to figure out what do those 30 patients have in common. But this approach is fraught with problems. First of all, in such a small data set, those 30 patients are going to be outliers respective to the broader community. That's also not a big enough data set to train a machine learning model. It's just a toy example. But as you know from talking to lots of experts in the space, coming up with a data set sufficiently large is really hard work, right? It's really challenging to get a sort of coherent clinical data set where you can look at a particular outcome and have a machine learning model figure that out. We take a different approach. Again, we think about the underlying biology of disease. One perhaps helpful way to consider it is the framework called the hallmarks of cancer. So there's a classic paper that was published 20 years ago that named 6 hallmarks of cancer. These are biological processes that underlie either the onset or the progression of disease. 10 years ago, they updated it, and there were 10 hallmarks, and last year it was updated again. Now there are 14. The point is that there are these biological processes that are appreciated to be really important. So Genialis will, for a particular class of drugs, let's say drugs that are targeting PD-L1, PD-1, or drugs that are targeting, I'm making these up, but drugs that are targeting like KRAS, for example, right? We think about what are the fundamental biologies that are downstream and adjacent to those drug targets that will define a phenotype that makes a patient susceptible to therapy. And once we've identified the biologies, what are the molecules that represent those biologies best or most meaningfully? And so this is where we start. There is a fair bit of human expertise that goes into it, but we also do this in a very data-driven way using bioinformatics and computational tools to scour the world of both clinical and preclinical experimental data that are relevant to that disease biology. Once we've established our framework of here are the biologies that matter for this particular model, and here are the molecules that matter for those biologies, then we train a machine learning model using sort of a curated training data set, a data set that we harmonize ourselves to teach the machine learning model what are the disease phenotypes. Again, what are the classes of disease? Each class of disease then has a therapeutic hypothesis. So let me try to make this really clear. We have a model called the Zerna TME panel that we built with a company called Cerna Therapeutics. It classifies patients based on their tumor microenvironment, and it classifies patients into one of four categories: immune active, immune desert, immune suppressed, or angiogenic. If a patient is immune active, then they should get a checkpoint inhibitor. And sure enough, that proves true. We've shown that the model works well for predicting checkpoint inhibitor efficacy. If the patient is angiogenic, they should get an anti-angiogenic like Avastin or ramucirumab or something similar. And we've shown the model does a good job of predicting that. If the patient is immune suppressed, this is where something like a combination approach or a next-gen immune oncology drug like an innate immune modulator comes into play. And sure enough, we've shown that the model is pretty good at predicting that. So in other words, the models we build define a phenotypic landscape. The phenotypes define the therapy. And in doing this, our models are really informative. It's not just, yeah, you're biomarker positive, get the new drug, or you're not, go back home. You actually get a wide array of information based on the way we construct these models.
A few episodes ago, we talked about the state of pharmacogenomics in 2023. Where are we at the moment? Because the idea seems great. You know, you do a genetic test for specific drugs and figure out how you metabolize them, and this can potentially help the clinician make an easier and better decision around prescribing, which is especially useful. And there's quite a lot of knowledge around pharmacogenomics, say, in mental health at the moment. So how would you put pharmacogenomics in context of what you do?
Yeah, I think pharmacogenomics, to my mind, and I guess it depends on the working definition, so correct me if I'm thinking of it differently than you, has a lot to do with kind of figuring out dosing and figuring out, a patient's response to a particular drug. And I think that's super important. In fact, I have a podcast episode coming out with a company that a CEO who works specifically on dosing models as a really important part of precision medicine. We use genomics data, and we like using transcriptomics data as the actual inputs to our assays. And we very often start with signatures that help us understand target coverage. So in that case, very much kind of a pharmacogenomic type model. But ultimately, the models we're building go a step beyond and a bit in a different direction, right? So we're building models that are, again, what I would call phenotypic classifiers of the disease. I think that, when you talk to people who do translational research in clinical development, there really is no one-size-fits-all kind of biomarker, right? So you need biomarkers, in my opinion, at every stage of drug discovery and development. Their biomarkers are great for target discovery, even going all the way to the earliest part of drug discovery and development. And Silico Medicine has their entire target discovery engine is a biomarker engine. That's how they do target discovery, for example. And then, of course, as you're working through the experimental validation, going into even like an IND filing for a new drug, having computational biomarkers, I think, can be super impactful. And I believe we're going to see going forward less and less reliance of regulators on older forms of preclinical evidence, especially certain animal models and in vitro models that don't represent the disease well, in favor of computational models that have been trained on human data and do represent the disease, right? And so then you get into first in human studies, having good PK/PD models are critical. Then you get into phase 2, phase 3, and this is where predictive models become super important. So you can streamline clinical trials. You can make sure you're finding the right disease indications in which to drug people. So, I think that pharmacogenomic models have a huge role to play. But again, there's sort of no one biomarker that rules them all. I think that we need these kinds of informative computational models at every stage.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely meaningful, especially knowing that at the moment it takes over 10 years to design, develop, and actually distribute a new drug. And I think the price of a new drug is still estimated, so the whole development process is still estimated at around 3 billion US dollars. So I'm kind of wondering, to which extent do you, as someone working in the industry, see that the time and costs could be reduced with just AI and computational model?
Mm.
At the end of the day, I mean, we also saw during the pandemic that the vaccine
Hmm.
was developed in, I think it was less than a year or something like that.
Yeah. Well, certainly with AI, we're seeing evidence already of the speed with which you can discover targets and discover new molecules, right? So the early stage stuff is moving much faster already. The kind of preclinical validation, the evidence you need to get to an IND, that hasn't changed a ton yet. Um, I belong to an organization called the Alliance for AI in Healthcare, and we do a lot of regulatory thought leadership and data thought leadership. And on the regulatory side, we are writing a framework for digitizing the IND so that more of that would be done with AI as well. But in clinical development, I think AI is having a real impact already, but I don't think it's started to impact the timelines as much as we might hope. And part of the reason why is that, well, the reasons why is that clinical development is slow and cumbersome and expensive for a huge number of reasons. One of them is just recruitment is hard, right? So when you have 10,000 clinical trials running for PD-L1 combinations, how are you going to find enough patients for all those trials, right? It's just hard to recruit, hard to enroll. Um, Access is a huge issue. We know that the gulf in information between big cancer centers and community hospitals and community clinics is huge, right? So access to the latest drugs and latest clinical trials can be slowed down just by access issues. These are all areas where I do think AI will have a difference. A lot of real world data efforts around trying to match patients to trials, I think, are going to make a difference. Helping even rank clinical trial sites and CROs so that drug companies work with the best companies that are most likely to improve things. Where Genialis is trying to chip away at this is we envision a world in which a lot of clinical trials are designed very specifically around kind of tailored patient populations. So I know there's an economic incentive to have your drug be labeled for everybody, right? Keytruda is a good example of this, where it's gotten very broad labels, although recently even biomarker-driven labels. We still see pretty low efficacy rates. So a more ethical world is one in which drugs have biomarker-defined labels from the outset. Those labels can expand over time. They probably will. But to design the trials and the strategy in the clinic from the beginning to find the patients who are going to benefit most and build very efficient trials around that. I think that will trim a fair bit of the development time down, but it's not going to solve all of the problems.
Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned pricing, I'm got kind of two questions there. So we talked about how difficult it is to recruit patients for clinical trials. At the same time, what we are discussing is precision medicine, and to a very kind of narrow point where basically you're
Mm-hmm.
almost designing a drug for a very, very small subset of patients. And
Mm-hmm.
so how do you envision the future of precision medicine if you can't really do large scale studies that would really confirm that this
Mm-hmm.
works? Are the criteria in terms of what's
Mm-hmm.
required in terms of the number of patients that need to test the drug, is that going to change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. So for biomarker-driven trials in general, there's no reason why you still can't have a large N number of patients for a lot of these things. Um, but there are statistics that allow you to power your trial with fewer patients, depending on what you're trying to test and prove. And if you have a way of pre-selecting patients, in principle, you can get the number of patients that you need for a properly powered trial down. The personalized medicine movement, where drugs truly are designed for individuals or small small cohorts, so certain gene therapies, cellular therapies, even potentially targeted therapies that look at specific protein conformations. Yeah, those are going to be very small trials. I think one potential solution is in the world we call digital twins. So this is not something Genialis does, but it's a branch of AI that I'm super excited about, or an AI application in healthcare, where we use AI to essentially create a digital placebo arm, right? So a control arm based on all the information we have about those patients, so that the patients are actually getting the medicine and their digital avatars is serving as the control. I don't know how soon we'll see that in cancer, but we're already starting to see some progress towards that in certain neurodegenerative diseases and elsewhere. And there's a strong ethical case, I think, to make for the use of digital twins in a lot of disease settings where, patients are sick, and giving them not the most promising thing is not really an option.
How come you don't use digital twins yet? How deeply are you looking into that? There's a lot of companies focused on that too.
Yeah. Well, just because, companies have to focus on something, right? So I like the idea of digital twins, and I think in the long run, this is going to be part of Genialis's toolbox, especially around the idea of building molecular digital twins, right? So you could, a lot of the digital twin efforts right now are based on EHR data, real world data. I think that molecular digital twins is a perfectly viable approach, especially in a cancer setting where the disease is often due to molecular dysregulation. So thinking about having kind of, a genomic but also transcriptomic digital twin where you have healthy normal makes a lot of sense to me.
hmm I was thinking actually more about partnering with companies that basically are just
Hmm.
focused on digital twins. Is that not possible?
No, it's certainly possible. And Genialis has a very, open-armed partnership model. I think part of the challenge, frankly, though, is the digital twin movement is also a lot of startups. And, so most of Genialis's partnership focus is with larger organizations that rather than bringing another unique technology, have some other asset, either distribution or data to contribute. So, our partnership strategy right now is focused on a number of different market sectors, but we work a lot with big cancer centers and big academic clinical groups, right? Helping turn their troves of data into meaningful applications for patients. We also partner with diagnostics companies to take the algorithms we're developing with drug companies and turn them into actual commercial assays. Um, but no, it's a great idea. And again, I have friends who do digital twin stuff, and let's talk in 6 months or a year and see where that is on our strategic roadmap.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Genialis is also a startup, but I think you've got like around a decade of work under your belt at least. So, what would you say are some of the biggest successes in terms of can you maybe illustrate with specific examples where the use of the solution really made a difference for patients?
Yeah, so the model that we've built and kind of brought furthest along is the Zerna TME panel, which again we built with a company called Onccerna Therapeutics. And what was impressive to me about that is Genialis had been a tools company. We built some really great software for genomics analysis and use in both R&D and clinical settings. In 2018 or so, we decided to do more of the R&D for ourselves. So we kind of pivoted into a discovery company where we were building, again, biomarkers that would have clinical application. Within about a year and a half of embarking on that work, our partnership with Onccerna Therapeutics had already yielded a model that was embedded at a CRO and was forming the basis of an application for a phase 2/3 pivotal clinical trial. That trial is yet to start enrolling yet, but it should soon. But it showed that our technology suite and our rather unique approach to building these phenotypic classifiers that have multiple therapeutic intervention, strategies can very quickly go from concept into a clinical device and into something that can actually touch patients' lives. And so that's when we really kind of doubled down on this idea of let's build more of these. Let's have an entire armament of these phenotypic classifiers such that any cancer patient can have their tumor classified by a Genialis classifier and pointed in the right direction.
When we talk about precision medicine, we often talk about oncology, or rare diseases which are very specifically tied to mutations in genes. So I'm kind of wondering, you mentioned earlier how basically when it comes to the price of medication, the incentive is
Hmm.
to create drugs that can have a large pool of customers. And this is not the case with these precision drugs. And this is why they are also super expensive. If we just look at, say, the drug for spinal muscular atrophy, it
Hmm.
costs 2 million US dollars.
Right.
And we could probably name other examples that are really, really expensive. So how do you see that dilemma in terms of the pricing? I mean, these calculations are usually done on some sort of calculations of the
Hmm.
lifetime therapy versus that one-time therapy that solves the problem, but it still can hinder access to care.
Yeah. Yeah, no, drug pricing is a thorny issue for sure. I mean, there are certain areas where I think, companies like ours can make a difference, and some things, especially on the policy side. And don't get me started in the U.S. about the different layers of inefficiency around drug pricing. Um, maybe a little bit harder for us to touch, but certainly decreasing the time it takes to get a drug, from discovery to market can help. Decreasing the cost by, again, making the trials more efficient, decreasing the overall failure rate. So, that's a huge deal, especially in oncology, where 96 to 97% of drugs that enter clinical trials never make it to market, right? So we're paying a lot for drugs because it costs a lot in failed opportunities to get there. So trying to solve some of those problems are things that I think we can do immediately. But there's also a vision of the future that I think is important for anyone who works in precision medicine. And that's one where policymakers and providers, so the hospitals themselves, and payers, whoever's doing the reimbursement, whether it's insurance companies or national healthcare systems, all of these folks, I believe, will begin to insist on values-based healthcare, on outcome-based healthcare. So they're going to want to know that if we're paying $250,000 or $2 million a year for a drug, that drug's going to work, right? And if you think about, I'm just going to pick on Keytruda because it's famous. Obviously, it's a great drug for a lot of patients, but it's not a great drug for a lot of patients, and they still get it and they still pay for it, right? So imagine, instead of having 65% of the people who are getting a $250,000 a year drug not get that and get something that's more likely to work, right? I think that kind of insistence is going to have to be largely top down, but I also think, we're probably within certainly a half generation of realizing that is the major paradigm. So in that sense, all medicine will become precision medicine, because if you want to be guaranteed that the medicine is going to work for the patient you're giving it, you're going to need a biomarker model to make that as likely as possible.
I think that's a great cue to kind of start the discussion around who the patients are. When we
Mm-hmm.
uh, talk about patients in a general sense, we kind of think that there's a solution for
Mm-hmm.
every patient. But especially in the last
Mm-hmm.
few years, there's been a lot of awareness raised around the problems with data sets, the challenges in the bias in terms of what kind of data sets are currently used in scientific research and
Mm-hmm.
testing. So how do you see that issue, and
Yeah.
how do you basically take care that your data sets are diverse, that they are as unbiased as possible? To which extent can then that be addressed?
Yeah, this is a huge concern, and frankly, it's a concern across the entire world in all sectors with the emergence of AI. Is that AI is only as smart as the data it's seen, and if the data that it's seen is limited in one way or another by bias, then the model's not going to work for everybody. In the case of healthcare, you can imagine any number of kinds of biases, right? So these could be ethnic or sort of genetic origin, right? So if you have mostly Northern European or white European descendants represented in your data set, then stands to reason that's who the model's going to work for and not for other people. Um, you might not be amazed, but some of your listeners might be amazed to find out just how often women are underrepresented in healthcare data. It's a huge problem. I've written some essays about this, especially after reading Invisible Women, which is a book that chronicles the data gap and the biases regarding gender. So we take this very seriously at Genialis. I mentioned that our training data sets, we curate by hand. We curate them specifically for the model we're trying to build. And one of the things that we attempt to do is to make sure that the data are as representative as possible. So you can essentially address bias at 2 points in this process. Up front, in terms of, well, really 3 points. Up front, in terms of constructing a data set that is inclusive. In choosing the features that go into your model. So here I mean, what are the actual genes we're measuring in the model? And to make sure that those genes are consistent performing across different sources of bias, right? So that those genes behave the same in this subgroup of people, in this subgroup of people, in that subgroup of people, or even on this technology platform, and that technology platform, and this technology platform. And then the third place is once you've built the model, you need to validate the hell out of it. You need to test it on as many different independent data sets, ideally from the real world as possible, right? To prove to yourself that it's going to work and scale. So Genialis has invented a bunch of really cool technologies, and we filed some patent applications on some of these that allow us to do the upfront work of figuring out what genes are going to behave across different clinical contexts. And again, this is super important not only for the kind of human diversity that you encounter in the world, but also assay diversity. If you're trying to build something, a clinical assay that's going to be able to reach people everywhere, you want to make sure that however those data are going to be able to be generated in the real world is going to work with your model. And so even changing the chemistry of the kind of next-gen sequencing you're doing from one data set to the next can throw off a model. So addressing these kinds of technology biases up front is important too. So we've worked on some tech to make sure that the features themselves are critical, are critically across these different modalities. We've invented some AI models that we use to do quality control on our data. So, for example, we have a gender classifier. You'd be amazed how often you get a data set that are mislabeled. So we actually classify all of our data based on molecular markers of gender to make sure, or I should say sex rather, to make sure that we have equal representation. And we can do this for other kinds of biological diversity that we need to make sure that we have in the data set. And then the last piece, again, is fast forward to when you have a trained model of doing the independent validation. We've developed some cool technology that allows us to very quickly harmonize new data sets that come in from the real world to make sure that they're applicable to our model irrespective of the data space the model is trained on. And this has proved crucial as we deploy models we've built into different organizations. We've baked the model into a CRO. We've also licensed it to a few different diagnostics companies. Each of those companies has its own workflow, its own setup. It's going to be generating data from different diseases, different patient groups. We want to make sure all those new independent data sets can be applied equally robustly to this model so we can validate that, in fact, it works across clinical scale.
How is the whole movement around generative AI impacting you?
I mean, generative AI is huge. Where it's most impactful today in pharmaceutical world, I think, is in discovering new molecules, right? It's actually coming up with new molecules. But there's also generative biology as another, so that's generative chemistry. You can also do generative biology. And again, you can train models, or models can learn to come up with sort of new biological scenarios. So that could be new targets and new biomarkers. I think where it's generative AI is going to impact Genialis the most is in that regard. It's using generative AI to come up with sort of I'll call them newly framed biological processes that are not the canonical ones that we think about, when you read your textbooks. But overall, I think generative AI is going to have a huge impact on the industry. We're already seeing, again, the speed with which we can come up with new chemistries if we have a good target we trust.
In that regard, in regards to the AI, what specifically has changed for you in the last 10 years? So how would you describe the whole progress that's been made in AI in the last 10 years based on your example?
I mean, it's been huge. When 10 years ago, so Genialis isn't quite that old, but when we were looking at sort of interesting applications of AI, most of what we were thinking about at the time, at least in our company, were sort of, supervised learning models where, again, you would have a data set where patients responded a certain way, and you would try to, tease out based on having labeled those patients as being responders, what was going on. But again, the small data problem that's pernicious in clinical data sets makes that not super practical. So then you had the advent of deeper networks, graph convolutional networks, autoencoders, and things of this nature. And those are actually, to me, intellectually, some of the coolest examples of where AI has progressed. This idea that you can have knowledge graphs and embed multiple knowledge graphs into a single network is really, really cool, because in a way it kind of mimics how I think biology actually works. The idea of a neural network in the first place was inspired by biology, right? It was inspired by the way that neurons all connect. So then if you extend the analogy and start thinking about graph convolutional networks, and you think about inside our biology, maybe a cell or a tissue could be represented by a particular graph. And then another cell or another tissue could be represented by a different graph of interacting molecules and structures. You can start to imagine or envision a world in which you have an AI that actually recapitulates a human body. Now, I don't know that we're super close to that, but I think the analogy extends from a neural network wanting to look like a brain to a graph convolutional network wanting to be the whole organism. And I think that's super cool.
Mm-hmm. I've just been thinking about, what kind of new discoveries can we still come up with the existing knowledge that we have,
Mm-hmm.
and basically with AI and new ideas. And I know that we, again, talked mostly around about the genetics and around basically gene therapies. But
Mm-hmm.
to which extent do you think we can leverage more from the existing drugs that
Mm-hmm.
are kind of simpler in a sense, and figure out how they could be repurposed? Because that's also another thing that's interesting for pharma. How can we add additional indications to the
Mm-hmm.
drugs that exist? And there's this
Yeah.
question that patients kind of have when you go to the pharmacy. Maybe there's actually a
Mm-hmm.
drug there that could help you.
Yeah.
It's just not indicated for your problem just yet.
It's a great question. I don't want to call repurposing low-hanging fruit because it's not easy, but I think it's an immediate priority. It needs to be an immediate priority. We've got tens of thousands of molecules that have been in patients, right, that are not today medicines. And then we've got loads of approved medicines that we think we understand well, or at least we have enough data that we could start to understand, and don't need to go through new approval processes, right, because we've already shown that they're at least safe and tolerated and effective for some things. So I think that drug repurposing and indication expansion are the two kind of most obvious and important things to do with the kinds of technologies that Genialis works with, specifically with models that understand the patient biology and therefore can point you to what you should be treating with. Discovering new drugs is great, right? That's important, but it has a long road. Even with all the AI helping out, it's still a decade long or more process. Discovering new drug targets is important because it's clearly we don't really understand how to treat all diseases. But we do have medicines that work, and they don't always work for reasons that we humans understand, but we can teach machines to figure out what's going on. So I think that for better or for worse, the investor community kind of lost its excitement over drug repurposing as a business model. And therefore, for a while, for about a year and a half, 2 years, a lot of companies were talking about AI for drug repurposing. And then we quit talking about it because it didn't excite people. But I still think it's super important, and I still think we all kind of do it. We just talk about it differently. Benevolent AI, which was one of the real groundbreakers and trailblazers in the space, that's how they proved their tech worked, right? They were able to go from zero to a drug, in a new indication, 6 months. It was awesome. It was a great proof of concept. Let's keep doing that. So I think, to make repurposing more fashionable, and something that more companies do unabashedly, and to really deliver that impact for patients in a short time frame, that's the advantage of repurposing, right? It's a short time frame. We need to think about addressing the business models more than anything else. I think the technology is there. I think we have a pretty good idea of how to do it. But I think you have to start thinking about business models and kind of investment models for that.
Speaking of business models, if we go back to the data challenges that we spoke about earlier, how do you operate on different markets, and how do you see all the debates around how data should or shouldn't be shared. There's a lot of dissatisfaction around the high legislation kind of restrictions
Yeah.
in Europe. We also, like in previous episodes, I spoke with just people from China that said that, if you work with the government there, you can get a lot of data, but the problem is that whatever you develop there, you can't export out of
Right.
China. So even if you do something, you can't get it out. So how are you going towards that problem? Are you kind of excluding yourself from specific markets because of their
Hmm.
specifics, or?
Yeah, no, it's a huge challenge. And part of the challenge is just understanding the different jurisdictions, right? So what are you allowed to do in different places? Genialis primarily operates in North America and Europe, but not exclusively. We do work in Asia. We're exploring data partnerships on other continents as well. And of course, not only every continent and every kind of economic bloc, but also every country has its own rules. So it is tricky. We have a full-time compliance officer, and she herself is pretty overworked, right? Um, but we don't shy away from interesting data just because it may be tricky to work with. There are solutions, right? So things like federated learning solutions are possible. Our technology infrastructure is highly portable, right? We can stand it up on any computer anywhere, basically. So we can use data in situ if it's not allowed to leave the site. I think, though, there's a bit of a disturbing trend, which is uh, from policymakers and politicians, a rush to put in legislation around privacy that can be very short-sighted. I read an interesting blog piece of someone who's just, you know, taking the gloves off and being really critical of what is happening all over Europe in terms of privacy rules. Even with something as silly as web cookies, like how many people really care? How often do you just like click as fast as you can to yes, accept all cookies? I just want to go to the website, right? I think that the pattern of sort of defaulting in or defaulting out is maybe inverted of how it should be. I think that most patients, most people, if explained to them as, would you like your healthcare data to go towards helping other people find cures, would say yes, and would be completely aghast at how hard that actually can be. We are trying to build a partnership with one particular hospital. They've got super interesting data for us, and rather unique data around a couple diseases we're interested in. And it's just mind-bogglingly challenging to get off the ground because they themselves don't understand what they're allowed to do, right?
Hmm.
And
That's in
and so this
Europe.
is pretty. That one's in Europe, and
Yeah,
that's pretty
yeah.
typical. Um, but even when you go to very well-resourced and famous, cancer centers in the U.S., for example, oftentimes you'll run into this very real challenge. They're not sure what data they have. They're not sure what patient samples they have. Somewhere there's an electronic health record, or more likely two or three different systems where those information are captured. But just, writing the basic catalog hasn't been done in most cases. And there are some companies that I think have done a very good job of building big data catalogs where they kind of purpose built these things. But for the rest of it, and especially for actual like community practice and cancer care, we're trying to retrofit a lot of stuff, and it's just a lot of work.
Hmm. You talked about a lot of challenges just now,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm not sure how the next question is gonna go. Because one thing that I really wanted to ask you was, what's kind of the most difficult thing
Mm-hmm.
that you are currently facing as a company with the development of the solution?
Yeah, no, undoubtedly it's the data piece, and so Genialis has a very deliberate strategy of again curating the data sets we work with to be fit for purpose, right? So if we're building a model for a particular class of drugs or a class of diseases, we envision what is the ideal data set to let us model that, and then we go out and we build that data set, and we do it again through a lot of partnership work, in addition to the data we've already got pre-baked into our computational system. And so those just take time to build, right? They take energy to build, and scouring the earth for the right, patient samples is tricky. The alternative approach, which has worked well for some other companies, is to kind of take a let's just sequence it all, right? And so big companies like Tempus have amazingly rich data sets because they've taken a perhaps smart but also very capital intensive approach of, sequencing everything, often at cost or even, at a short-term loss in order to aggregate those data. that's kind of a shotgun approach, and we have more of a rifle approach of trying to be very precise about the data we're gathering. So yeah, the challenge is putting those together, but so far we've had pretty good success at that.
What do you look forward to most, and what kind of keeps you optimistic in terms of the future development?
Um, wow, what do I look forward to most? You know, honestly, I look forward most to just getting up and interacting with my colleagues every day. So there are two differentiators left. With AI being commoditized, increasingly commoditized, right, and the available public large language models and so forth, algorithms themselves are hardly a differentiator anymore. So data is a differentiator, but a really insightful friend of mine pointed out that culture and people is the biggest differentiator. And I think this is where Genialis excels the most. We've built such a unique company and such a unique team full of just really good people that that's what I look forward to the most, is getting up and working with them every day. In terms of what we're building, man, we're going to do some really big stuff this year. We are developing uh, a model for an emerging therapeutic area in cancer that I think is going to be hugely impactful. We have a new program we're kicking off with a new partner that we'll be talking about this fall that I think is going to be a proof of concept for our bigger scheme of how we ultimately have a biomarker model that works for all patients. So, you know, the technology we're developing is exciting. And I think, you know, 6 months from now, a year from now, that's what everyone's going to be talking about. But it's a privilege, it's a pleasure to get up and work with just such tremendous people in our company.
I think we could probably continue the discussion, but let's wrap it up for today. So, Rafael, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss biotech and the impact AI has had on it.
Josh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.